This is Historic Blah, where the past comes alive in minutes. Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe, and comment your city. I want to see where our history lovers are watching from. Story 1. The Flour Rebellion, Byzantine Bakers and Their Loaves of Protest. You wake to the soft clatter of hooves on cobblestones and the distant clang of a church bell no louder than the sigh of a tired smith. It's the 8th century, and you are in Constantinople, the heart of an empire both divine and bureaucratic. But while emperors are crowned, icons debated, and barbarians kept at bay, a quieter engine powers the city: bread. Bread is everything. Bread is survival. Bread is politics. In Byzantine Constantinople, the baker is no humble craftsman. He or she, though less commonly, holds a place as vital as any soldier or priest. This is a city of over 400,000 mouths, and nearly all of them consume the same staple daily: government-regulated bread made from state-distributed flour. The Byzantine capital relies not on free markets but on grain ships and ration lists. And at the center of this delicate equilibrium stands the baker, an unlikely keystone in the empire's civil order. The first loaves of the day emerge before sunrise, pulled from deep, smoky ovens by men who have worked through the night. Their faces are chalked with flour, sweat in their beards, hands calloused from kneading. These are not artisans for art's sake, they are logistical miracle workers. Each loaf must weigh precisely as decreed. Each must be sold at a fixed price. A deviation might mean a public lashing, or worse, suspicion of sedition. It is not uncommon for government officials to show up at bakeries with brass weights to inspect loaves. The weights are often rigged, but the bakers know this and compensate accordingly, weighing their flour by eye and experience rather than tool. This quiet rebellion, this passive adjustment, is one of many ways in which the baker lives between state service and street loyalty. You wouldn't think to look for rebellion in a boule, but in the alleys of Constantinople, political unrest brews with the yeast. Bread as currency, bread as control. The Byzantine state inherited and perfected the Roman model of grain distribution. Grain, particularly wheat, came from Egypt, long considered the granary of the empire. After Justinian's reign, and particularly following the loss of Egypt to Arab conquests, the grain supply grew precarious. What once arrived in vast shipments now trickled in from less reliable sources. And so, the bakers, always at the mercy of the state's ability to deliver flour, became sensitive barometers of civil tension. When grain ran low, bakers were often the first to know. The ships were late or short. The quality was poor, weevils in the sacks. The flour was gray, damp, unworkable. You couldn't bake with it well, you could, but people wouldn't buy it, not without complaint. And so the bakers adapted. They whispered to each other across neighborhoods. They told their best customers the news: the grain's thin this week, or the ovens may close early tomorrow. In time, bakers became informants not just on the conditions of bread, but of the state. A loaf that was underweight one week might signal imperial trouble. A loaf that was expensive could hint at a shortage. If your baker added barley to the mix, he was stretching supply. The city watched its bakers, and in turn, the bakers watched the empire. The guilds and the grain tables. Bakers in Constantinople belonged to guilds, formal professional associations that offered a blend of religious protection, social hierarchy, and workplace governance. These guilds were not merely ceremonial. The state relied on them. The Collegium Pastorum, a Roman institution, evolved into the Byzantine Syndesmos ton Artipicon, or Bakers' Guild. They had meeting halls, holy patrons, often Saint Honoratus, and written regulations. It was a double-edged blessing. The state distributed flour in return for obedience. Bakers who misstepped might be fined, publicly punished, or removed from their ovens altogether. A bakery could be shut with wax seals, its ovens cold for months. That meant families went hungry not just in the city, but the families of the bakers themselves. The ovens provided income, yes, but also identity, inheritance, continuity. A baker's son was usually a baker, apprenticed before he could lift a sack. The trade passed down like the stories etched into the bakery walls, tales of past grain riots, of the great bread fires, of a long-dead patriarch who once saved a block from starvation by baking loaves from vinegar and lentil flour. Bread and riots. Perhaps the most famous civil disturbance in Constantinople, the Nika riots of 532, had more to do with chariot racing than bread. But just below that spectacle, behind the chaos, were deeper concerns: discontent over taxes, mismanagement, and hunger. When people starved, they gathered at the hippodrome. They shouted not just for their racing faction, the Blues or the Greens, but for justice, for food, for attention. Bakers were often the first to know something was wrong. They heard whispers while selling loaves, caught half-sentences while kneading dough. They served the poor and the rich alike. A palace servant might grumble over rising prices. A soldier's wife might ask for yesterday's bread, unable to afford today's. This duality, serving both ends of the social ladder, placed the baker in a rare position of power. They didn't speak at Senate meetings or whisper behind the curtains of imperial chambers, but they were listened to in ways that mattered. You can ignore a philosopher, but you can't ignore hunger. At times, bakers would even signal their displeasure not with words but with the absence of bread. Imagine waking one morning to find your neighborhood oven unlit. No smells of baking, just a note posted on the door: no flour today. That wasn't just a message, it was a warning. Sometimes it was true, often it was strategic. The bakers had learned that silence spoke volumes. The bakers become criers. Over time, this informal communication network matured. A baker might mention to a customer that the imperial court is ordering more flour than usual, or that a tax official came asking for extra loaves. These weren't idle comments. These were news. In an empire without newspapers, where information moved slowly and was tightly controlled, bakers became something unexpected: unofficial town criers. The state knew this. It tried to regulate it, of course. Edicts were issued warning bakers not to spread rumors, but how could you regulate a whisper? How could you fine a shared frown? You couldn't. And so, despite all intentions, the flour men became the barometers of Byzantine anxiety. They were the first to know when ships were delayed, when taxes were raised, when an emperor took ill. Bread became a medium not of sustenance only, but of message. And yet, with all this unspoken power, how did these men and the women who occasionally managed or inherited bakeries resist the urge to formalize their influence? Why didn't they take it further? Why didn't the bakers of Constantinople rise not just as quiet criers, but as loud revolutionaries? That is a story we must pause here and pick up with a deeper exploration of power, punishment, and resilience in Section 2. You're back in Constantinople, noisy, solemn, and flowered in dust, a city built of domes and oaths. But this morning, something is wrong. Your neighborhood bakery isn't baking. There's no scent of dough crisping in the oven, no boys running loaves down the street, no idle chat over bread benches. Instead, a sign on the locked wooden doors scrawled in rushed ink: no flour, no fire. Except you know that's not true. Everyone knows. The grain arrived 3 days ago late, yes, but the sacks were seen rolled into the city's communal storehouses. The bakers were allotted their rations, but now their ovens are cold by choice. And that is where the real power lies. Bread as protest, the quiet strikes of Constantinople. In the Byzantine world, loud rebellion often met swift and violent ends. The empire was expert at squashing dissent, even when it came in the form of unpaid scribes or underfed soldiers. But the bakers, ever subtle, operated differently. They didn't riot, they didn't march. They withheld bread. This wasn't mere protest, it was strategy. It drew attention but rarely blood. A baking pause, as it might be called, signaled discontent without outright rebellion. The message was clear: we are not pleased. Fix it or the city goes hungry. These acts weren't entirely spontaneous, nor were they entirely unified. Bakers were competitive, and loyalty to the guild did not erase personal ambition. But when grain prices were slashed unfairly or flour weights tampered with by tax officials, the guilds met, sometimes quietly in candlelit halls, sometimes in the back of a bakery under the guise of kneading. There were even whispered tales, possibly exaggerated, that the bakers coordinated through coded messages in bread itself. A slight change in crust pattern, a shaved mark in the surface of a loaf, a deliberate absence of sesame seed. Most of these were likely apocryphal, but they underscore one truth: the bakers had created a language of resistance. And the empire noticed. The state strikes back, punishment by fire and law. Constantinople was many things: spiritual seat, trade hub, fortress, but it was also a city of law. A bureaucracy ancient and meticulous watched over its people, and while bakers were essential, they were never safe from scrutiny. The Notitia Dignitatum, a late Roman administrative list adopted and expanded by Byzantium, carefully delineated the roles of food regulators. The Comes Sacrarum Largitionum, or Count of the Sacred Largus, oversaw grain distribution, taxation, and importantly enforcement. If a baker was caught underweighting loaves, the punishment could be public shamming, fines, or imprisonment. But collective action, that was something else. A baking pause wasn't just a disruption, it was economic sabotage. Some bakers were arrested, not just fined but paraded through the forums with wooden loaves chained around their necks, mock bread as symbol of their defiance. Their ovens were sealed with imperial wax. If they broke the seal, they risked permanent closure or exile. One incident, described vaguely in the Chronographia of Theophanes, tells of a baker named Georgios in the early 9th century. After refusing to sell bread due to unfair measure, he was dragged before a judge, fined, and whipped. But 3 weeks later, he reopened with his name freshly etched into the lintel of the shop. He baked exact loaves, neither a dram over nor underweight. His customers quietly called him the judge of bread. Punishment bred caution, but it also bred cleverness. The flour underground, quiet support networks. After several public punishments, bakers began developing informal support networks. It wasn't unlike a mutual aid society, an underground economy of sharing. When a baker's flour was confiscated, others might lend their surplus in secret. When an oven was shuttered, another baker might quietly add a few extra loaves and send them down the alley by a trusted apprentice. The bakers who had once competed for customers now collaborated for survival. Guild records where they survived show a surprising number of small fines being paid anonymously. A baker fined 20 numismata, a solidus coin, for price irregularity, might have half that covered by unnamed peers. These were acts of quiet rebellion, sustained by the knowledge that the state could break an individual, but struggled against a collective. And what's more, the people were on their side. Customers sympathized with the bakers because their lives were intertwined. A family might rely on a single loaf per day. If a baker went silent, a neighborhood might go hungry. So when bakers pushed back quietly, cautiously, they found allies not in courts but on the cobbled streets. The bakers became not just suppliers but sentinels. The bakers and the bureaucrats, a tense alliance. Eventually, the state adapted too. It recognized that pushing bakers too far threatened not only the economy but also civil peace. So, a truce of sorts developed, uneasy and ever-shifting. Officials began offering grain stipends to select bakeries during times of shortfall. These stipends weren't just payment, they were bribes, meant to ensure that at least a portion of the city remained fed. In return, some bakeries were licensed more formally, allowed to expand or hire additional apprentices. These were the so-called imperial ovens. Their bread bore official seals, sometimes imprinted in wax or clay. This seal ensured not just legality but loyalty. But being marked as an imperial oven came with a cost. These bakers were watched more closely, their loaves scrutinized for weight, their gossip monitored. It is likely that these bakeries were sometimes used to spy on their peers, feeding information back to the grain officials. So now you had a new conflict, baker versus baker. Some were collaborators, others rebels. Some balanced between both roles, whispering warnings in the morning and sealing official loaves by noon. And always the people listened. Because in this city, where walls had ears and bread bore news, even the weight of a loaf carried meaning. Ovens as oracles. Some bakers leaned into their unofficial status as informants. They learned to speak in euphemisms. A loaf with a lighter crust. The fire's burning weak this week, a nod to failing leadership. A round boule flattened on one side. Seems like someone leaned too hard on the dough, perhaps a remark on a heavy-handed tax law. Customers picked up the language. People would nod, chuckle, walk away thinking they'd simply heard gossip. But really, they were being briefed. There are even records of certain noble households requesting bread not for sustenance but for intel. A well-connected noblewoman might send her servant to a favored bakery not just for loaves, but for news. "Any word from the harbors?" she might ask. Or, "Has anyone from the palace been by this week?" The baker would answer carefully. The oven had become an oracle. And yet, with all this power channeled through fire, flour, and silence, the question remains, why didn't the bakers form something more formal? Why didn't they seize on this influence to shape politics directly? Because they knew what others didn't. The empire never forgot. One false move, a misweighed loaf, a loose word, a withheld delivery, and it could all come crashing down. The quiet rebellion worked precisely because it was quiet. But that doesn't mean the flour men never pushed further. One winter in the reign of Emperor Leo V, the city experienced what some later called the Great Cooling. The grain ships were frozen in place, loaves were sparse, the fires flickered. And in the midst of that cold, the bakers made a decision, one that would forever cement their legacy not just as suppliers, but as actors in history. But that is a story for another fire and another day. It is winter in Constantinople, real winter, not the mild kind softened by the sea's embrace. Snow curls along rooftops, slush pools in the gutters, and smoke drifts from chimneys like sighs. The city is still, brittle, waiting. But something is wrong. The grain ships, usually tethered to the wharves by mid-November, are frozen on the Bosphorus. Ice locks them in place like ancient tombs. Their crews pace the decks, peering toward the city's silhouette. Inside the walls, silence. No deliveries, no movement, just cold ovens and colder fear. This is the Great Cooling during the reign of Emperor Leo V in the early 9th century. A weather anomaly likely linked to a volcanic event or an early frost triggers weeks of hard freeze. The ships can't dock. The flour doesn't move. And the bakers can't bake. The ovens go cold. In the early days of the freeze, bakers wait patiently. They've seen shortfalls before, delays, spoiled flour, sudden demands by soldiers or clerics. The guilds hold emergency meetings, huddled under oil lamps in the back rooms of taverns, tallying their remaining supplies. There is enough flour for perhaps 5 more days, maybe 7 if stretched. The state offers no clear guidance. No grain redistribution, no emergency reserves. The first bakeries begin rationing loaves smaller sizes, thicker crusts to disguise reduced dough. People notice, of course. They always notice, but they accept it. They always accept it until they don't. By the end of the first week, tempers fray. By the end of the second, people go hungry. The bakeries begin to shudder, quietly. No signs this time, just silence. The firewood isn't worth wasting, the flour's all gone. Except for one bakery. One small shop, nestled near the Forum of Constantine, keeps its oven lit. The baker, his name is Anastasios, remembered not for fame but for flour, uses his remaining stock not to sell loaves, but to give them away. Just a dozen loaves. One per household. Free. The gesture stirs the city. Bread as beacon. No one expected it. Certainly not the palace, still mired in religious disputes and iconoclastic politics. Not the grain officials, busy drafting excuses. Not even the other bakers, who had resigned themselves to weathering the crisis in silence. But Anastasios changes something. He doesn't write a manifesto. He doesn't petition the emperor. He just hands out bread. One loaf at a time. By day 3, the line stretches around the forum. The loaves are thin, misshapen, partly barley, but they're warm and free. And more importantly, they are a message. Someone is listening. The act does not go unnoticed. City officials arrive to question him. Where did he get the flour? Who authorized this? Why didn't he register the distribution with the local granary inspector? He says nothing, reportedly, just keeps baking. But the people speak for him. They crowd the forum steps. They chant not angrily, not violently, but rhythmically, bread for the city, warmth for the people. It is, perhaps, the quietest protest Constantinople had ever seen. And it spreads. The guilds respond. The bakers' guild, once fractured by competition, divided by imperial favor, responds in solidarity. They call for a coordinated action, not a strike, not a shutdown. A gift. Every bakery is to take whatever flour remains, barley, rye, wheat, even old stocks, and bake until the ovens go empty. The loaves are to be marked with a symbol, a small cross made by pressing a string into the dough before baking. Not religious, necessarily, but unmistakable. These would be gift loaves. They are not to be sold, only given. It is not a coordinated uprising. It is not loud, but it is a statement of priorities. In a city ruled by bureaucracy and sacred hierarchy, the bakers reclaim a simple truth. Bread belongs to the people. The imperial dilemma. The emperor and his advisors are trapped politically, not just meteorologically. If they suppress the bakers, they risk a riot. If they support them openly, they appear weak, bending to unsanctioned civilian initiative. So they choose the path Byzantines so often chose. They rewrite the story. A proclamation is issued. In his wisdom and mercy, Emperor Leo recognizes the noble humility of the city's bakers. He declares a holy week of bread, during which the ovens shall burn in honor of the city's resilience. The state shall oversee this generosity, in communion with the guilds. It is a fiction, of course. The bakers acted first, but history belongs to the victors or the scribes. The edict legitimizes the action while claiming it as imperial policy, but the people know, they remember, and the bakers remember too. From that point on, the bakeries that survived the winter bore small new signs on their doors. Warmth in loaves, not in gold. A reminder of that week when bread became more than bread. A legacy beyond the loaf. What changed? Not much, at least on paper. The bakers returned to their regulated weights. The flour quotas resumed. The ships thawed. The brass weights reappeared. Life returned to its bureaucratic balance. But something did change deep in the cultural marrow of the city. The bakers were no longer just providers. They were guardians of civic memory. They had shown that resilience didn't have to roar, it could rise slowly, in an oven at dawn. Their actions inspired other trades. The city's candlemakers began pooling tallow for public temple lighting during religious festivals. The sandal makers offered winter discounts for children. None of it was organized. All of it was remembered. And generations later, when the city faced siege, famine, and finally conquest, the stories survived. Some chroniclers mention them. Others simply hint. One notes, when there was no word from the palace, we waited for the bakeries. Another writes, "The last fire we saw was not from a sword but from a bakery." You are left to wonder how many silent revolutions were never written because they weren't loud enough for ink. How many unnamed bakers shaped the fate of cities through the simple act of feeding. How many ovens lit the night, not just with fire but with hope. Perhaps if we listened more to the ordinary, the flour, the loaves, the empty shelves, we might understand history not as battles and thrones, but as bread and breath and quiet resolve. Story 2. Salt, Silence, and Surveillance. The Venetian glassmaker's house arrest. The city of Venice glitters on the water, like a dream woven from sunlight and salt. Its bridges arch like sighs, its towers lean in quiet conversation, and its streets wet and uncertain echo the creak of oars and the hush of slippers over stone. But behind the shimmer, past the Grand Canal, beyond the Doge's palace and its Gothic shadows, lies an island rarely mentioned, but always guarded. Murano. To the casual visitor of the 13th century, Murano may appear quaint, an island of modest homes, tidy gardens, and the hum of workshops. But in reality, this is a fortress of flame, a place where the furnaces never go cold, where the sand turns to glass, and where silence is not only golden, it is required. Because Murano is where the glassmakers live, and they are not free to leave. The origins of a shimmering prison. To understand Murano, one must understand Venice, both its beauty and its paranoia. By the late 1200s, Venice had grown rich on salt, silk, and diplomacy. The sea was its empire, and secrecy was its security. The Republic thrived by knowing what others didn't, and trading it carefully, be it pepper or politics. Among its most guarded secrets was the recipe for crystal-clear glass. For centuries, European glass had been clouded, coarse, or fragile. The secret to clarity was known only in the Islamic world, in Syria, Egypt, and later Persia. But by the mid-13th century, Venice had developed its own techniques, combining pure silica, ash, and lime in precise ratios, heating it with alder wood at high temperatures, then cooling it ever so slowly. The result, vetro di Murano glass that was clearer than water, smoother than silk. And the men who made it were both envied and watched. To prevent industrial espionage, or more accurately, artisanal abduction, the Republic of Venice did something radical. It forcibly relocated all major glassmaking operations to Murano, an island just 1 mile north of the city. The official reason: fire prevention. Venice, with its narrow alleys and wooden buildings, was a tinderbox. Glass furnaces burned day and night at thousands of degrees. A single spark could ignite a district. But the real reason: control. By isolating the glassmakers, the Republic could both protect its secret and keep the craftsmen close enough to monitor, but far enough to be out of sight. They called it protection. Others called it a prison gilded with glass. A life forged in flame. Imagine you are born into a glass-making family on Murano in the year 1304. Your father is a maestro, your mother tends to the home, and the smell of ash lives in your clothes. By age 6, you're watching. By age 10, you're turning rods. By 12, you know how to mix the soda ash just right. You learn that the furnace must be watched like a child. It sulks, it flares, it breathes. You don't speak much. You listen. Because the walls here. There is no apprenticeship outside Murano. If you want to make glass, you live here. If you want to leave, you can't. The law is clear. No glassmaker may leave Murano without permission. If you do, and if you take the secrets with you, you may be hunted down. Some say there were agents, men in cloaks, sent by the Council of 10 to recover or eliminate deserters. That may be exaggeration, but not much. Glass was a military technology as much as an artistic one. It was used for lenses, for mirrors, for signal devices. A mirror in the right court could mean power. A telescope in the right hands could mean war. The Republic understood this. So you, the craftsman, you live on the island. You are not chained, but you are not free. And yet there are privileges. The glassmakers become nobility. To ensure loyalty, the state offers the glassmakers certain rights. They are allowed to carry swords, an honor forbidden to most non-nobles. Their daughters may marry into Venetian patrician families, unusual for artisans. Their guilds are respected, their complaints heard. Some even own palazzi along the canals of Murano, homes that glint with light cast through colored glass windows. Over time, the island becomes known as much for its architecture as for its products, a peculiar blend of opulence and isolation. By the early 14th century, Murano glassmakers developed specific specialties. Cristallo, colorless, nearly flawless glass, so clear it rivaled mountain spring water. Latimo, milky white glass, resembling porcelain made by adding tin oxide. Aventurina, glass speckled with copper crystals, resembling gold flecks. Millefiori, 1,000 flowers, patterns of tiny glass blossoms frozen inside canes. Each recipe is documented, but only within the guild registers, guarded and sealed, passed from master to apprentice under solemn oaths. If a recipe is stolen or worse, shared, there are punishments, fines, banishment, and according to some sources, more final resolutions. So you learn to keep quiet. You train your tongue like you train your hand. You do not whisper formulas. You do not discuss technique outside the furnace halls. Even your sleep is shadowed by caution. Glass and espionage. Despite the restrictions, other nations begin to suspect the value of Murano's glass. French and Spanish courts send emissaries not just for trade but for knowledge. Some try to bribe apprentices. Others offer marriage contracts to glassmakers, daughters, an indirect route to the secrets. It works. A few craftsmen do defect. Some escape with copied recipes, fleeing to northern Europe, where towns like Altair in Italy and later Bohemia begin their own glass traditions. Each escape is seen as a betrayal not just of the guild, but of the Republic itself. Venice responds with more oversight. Glassmakers traveling for exhibitions or court commissions must report their every movement. Families of defectors are sometimes interrogated or pressured. The ovens remain lit, but the heat now includes paranoia. And you, the glassmaker, find yourself burning not only sand but also bridges. An island of silence. Despite the surveillance and the fear, Murano does not revolt. Its people adapt. They build a culture of precision, of pride, of quiet mastery. The silence becomes tradition. In taverns, you talk about fishing or music. You joke about the tides. You compliment each other's sandals. But no one speaks of the furnace. Not even to your children. You wait until they are old enough, until they understand that glass is more than beauty, it is knowledge, and knowledge is guarded. And when the time comes, you don't explain everything. You simply lead them to the fire and begin again. But how did this guarded tradition endure centuries of change? What happened when the secret got out? And what became of Murano when the Republic fell? Murano still glows at night. From across the lagoon, the orange flicker of the furnaces can be seen through the fog. The city of Venice sleeps behind her bridges and bell towers, but Murano does not. The glassmakers work through the night. Their hands move without hesitation, their eyes barely blinking as they spin molten light into goblets, chandeliers, and beads. It has been 2 centuries since the first glassmaker was confined to the island. 2 centuries of guarded recipes, secret formulas, and whispered warnings. But no secret can burn forever, not even in Venice. Changing tides, the world grows curious. By the early 15th century, the power of Venice begins to shift. The Republic still dominates Adriatic trade, but pressures are mounting. Portugal and Spain have opened oceanic routes to Asia. The Ottoman Empire is rising in the east. The Papal States flex their muscle inland. and France restless, large, and rich is curious. Glass is now more than decoration. It's a commodity of status and diplomacy, a mirror in a noblewoman's chamber, a delicate goblet in a royal toast, a window pane in a cathedral. Demand explodes. Murano cannot keep up, not alone. And this is when the cracks begin to show. Defection and duplication. Some glassmakers begin to leave quietly, deliberately, and illegally. They are lured with promises, gold, land, noble titles. Other courts want their skills. They offer workshops, assistance, even diplomatic immunity. The Venetian government, ever vigilant, attempts to track these defectors. Records suggest that the Council of Ten, Venice's most feared governing body, dispatched spies to observe foreign glasshouses. Reports were filed on everything from oven design to ash content in the crucibles. In 1454, a man named Baravier, one of Murano's most revered artisans, writes a letter to a friend in Florence warning of the ease with which our brothers are tempted abroad. He was not wrong. By the late 1400s, cities like Altair in Liguria, Nevers in France, and Bohemia in modern-day Czechia begin producing glass of comparable clarity. The monopoly weakens, the Republic's grip loosens. But still, Murano holds on. How? Because while techniques can be stolen, tradition cannot. The guilds double down. In response to defections, the Venetian guilds become more insular, more ceremonial, more vigilant. They begin writing more rules, more rituals, more layers of secrecy. To become a master, one must not only demonstrate skill, but oath a verbal commitment to protect the secrets, even at the cost of one's life. The guild halls are redesigned, some say, with false walls to prevent spying. Apprentices are not told full recipes until years into their training. Only direct family members may observe certain mixing processes. And the punishments grow sharper. A craftsman caught corresponding with foreign buyers might be fined, exiled, or mysteriously disappear. While stories of murder by poison or drowning may be embellished, the threat was very real. Surveillance no longer came just from the state, it came from within. Families watched each other. Workshops became fortresses. The island grew silent again. Glass becomes gold. Despite all this, Murano thrives. In fact, these very pressures make Murano glass more luxurious. What was once functional bowls, vases, drinking vessels becomes ornamental. Gilded goblets for the courts of Milan. Glass rosaries commissioned by Spanish clergy. Murrhine beads worn by Turkish traders. By the 16th century, Murano chandeliers illuminate the salons of Vienna and Krakow. Rich merchants send their sons to Venice with lists. Return with silk, saffron, and Murano crystal. Glass becomes the new diplomacy. Ambassadors are gifted glassware as tokens of favor. Emperors compete to own the finest sets. Even the Vatican requests custom pieces for its rituals. Ironically, the very secrecy that was meant to limit Murano's growth now fuels its prestige. To own Murano glass is to own mystery, refinement, and silence all in a single shimmering object. But behind the shine, something darker simmers. Inheritance and isolation. By the late 16th century, many glassmaking families had been producing for over 200 years. Skills are passed from father to son, father to son. The surnames become brands: Baravier, Seguso, Salviati. But that lineage becomes a trap. Sons are expected to stay. Daughters are expected to marry within the trade. Family feuds erupt over kilns, apprentices, or guild honors. Some young men flee the island not for profit, but for freedom to escape the burden of legacy. A few letters survive from apprentices writing to friends in Venice, describing Murano as both a furnace and a cage. One reads, "I smell of ash, my hands are glass, the sea is so close I can taste it, and yet I cannot cross it. The Republic responds with new incentives, larger homes, legal privileges, reduced taxes. But the truth remains. A Murano glassmaker is not a citizen first. He is a custodian. Of secrets, of silence, of the island itself. An uncertain fire. By the late 1600s, the island faces a new threat, not espionage or defection, but irrelevance. Other glass centers have risen. Bohemia now produces harder, more durable glass, better suited for engraving. England experiments with lead crystal, allowing for new brilliance and depth. Murano cannot compete technically. Its formulas, once sacred, now seem quaint. Worse, the world no longer fears Venetian power. The Republic has faded from military significance. Trade shifts toward the Atlantic. Venice is now romantic, not dominant. And yet Murano continues. The ovens burn. The island glows. Not as a secret anymore, but as a symbol. A symbol of tradition, of craft, of continuity in a world that forgets easily. But you must wonder, how did Murano survive the final death of the Republic in 1797? What happened when Napoleon arrived and the laws of confinement collapsed? Did the glassmakers flee, or did they stay out of choice rather than law? The year is 1797, and Venice is dying. Not with a scream, but with a signature. Napoleon Bonaparte, barely 30 years old, fresh from victories across northern Italy, does what centuries of siege, betrayal, and plague could not. He ends the Republic of Venice with a single treaty. No bombardment, no blaze, just a pen. In May, Venice's ruling council, the Serenissima, votes itself out of existence, surrendering to French occupation. The Lion of St. Mark is torn from its plinths, the great golden book of the state is shut, and for the first time in over a millennium, Venice is no longer Venetian. But out across the lagoon on Murano, the ovens still burn. The glassmakers do not stop, because they have never worked for emperors or popes or even the Doge. They work for glass. But this time, there are no laws keeping them on the island. Chains removed, but roots remain. Napoleon abolishes the old guilds. The strict rules that once bound families to Murano are erased. Apprenticeship oaths are no longer binding. The laws prohibiting glassmakers from leaving the island are dissolved. They are free. Free to leave. Free to sell. Free to teach. And some do. A handful of craftsmen head for the mainland. Others travel across Europe to exhibit their techniques. For the first time in centuries, a Murano artisan can give a public demonstration of glass blowing without risking imprisonment or worse. But most stay. Why? Because the isolation had become identity. To leave Murano was not just to abandon a workshop, it was to abandon home, legacy, and language. The furnaces had shaped them as much as they shaped the glass. There were no longer spies or guards, but the glassmakers still spoke in whispers, still taught their sons the slow movements, still passed down the secrets, not because the state demanded it, but because they believed in the silence. Even freedom could not extinguish tradition. The industrial age and the decline of craft. The 19th century brings disruption Murano had never imagined. Factories in Britain and Germany now produce thousands of identical glasses a day using molds, presses, and machines. They are cheap, durable, and critically unromantic. Murano's fragile, shimmering masterpieces look outdated, not in beauty but in economy. Why buy a hand-blown goblet when you can have 6 factory-pressed tumblers for half the price? Orders drop, workshops close. Some furnaces go cold for the first time in centuries. Even Venice itself has changed. The city becomes a destination for painters and poets. Byron swims the Grand Canal. Turner paints the fog. Tourists arrive by steamboat to admire ruins, not riches. But Murano does not become a ruin. Because something odd begins to happen. People want souvenirs. They want a piece of the mystery. Not to own a secret, but to hold a piece of what once was won. From secrecy to spectacle. By the late 1800s, Murano reinvents itself. Workshops open their doors not to defectors but to visitors. Glassblowing becomes a public performance. Tourists watch as a glob of molten glass becomes a horse, or a bird, or a carafe. The master spins the rod, nods to the crowd, and smiles as they applaud. It is no longer forbidden to share the technique. In fact, it's encouraged. Some studios even offer short lessons to the wealthy. What was once treason is now tourism. But the true techniques, the most delicate mixes of minerals, the precise ratios, the intuitive timing, they are still held quietly. The demonstrations are real, but they are curated. What the tourists see is art. What the families practice is still craft. The line between display and tradition is carefully walked. And so, Murano transitions from secrecy to symbolism. A symbol of patient skill, of fire tamed, of old Venice's spirit still alive, not in politics but in practice. A world war, a fire rekindled. The 20th century does not spare Murano. During both world wars, production halts, materials are scarce, trade routes are broken, some workshops are bombed, others become storage depots or even shelters. In 1944, the German occupation of northern Italy brings an end to many local businesses. A few glassmakers are conscripted, others go into hiding. But the fires are never out for long. By 1950, as Europe rebuilds, Murano finds a new audience, the modernist collector. Designers from Milan, Paris, and New York begin to see Murano not as quaint, but as avant-garde. The Baravier and Toso workshop pioneers bold, abstract pieces. Paolo Venini introduces minimalist forms in sharp colors. Art meets tradition. Murano becomes fashionable again, this time not for secrecy, but for style. You can now find Murano chandeliers in Las Vegas hotels, Murano vases in Manhattan lofts, Murano sculptures in Tokyo galleries. And still on the island, the furnaces burn. Glass in a digital world. Today, Murano is both old and new. Some workshops use digital thermometers and imported minerals. Others still use bellows and hand-harvested ash. The artisans blend centuries of knowledge with global demand. They stream demonstrations online. They sell through international catalogs. They teach. And yet there remains something unchanged. The master glassmaker still arrives before dawn, still listens to the rhythm of the furnace, still taps the rod on the edge of the bench, still teaches his apprentice when to twist, when to pull, when to let go. Because glass is not only made of minerals, it is made of timing, of intuition, of memory. And perhaps that is Murano's true secret. Not a formula for clarity, or a trick of temperature, but a commitment to patience. A thought for the end. Murano no longer guards its artisans with law or fear. There are no more spies in cloaks, no more edicts about exile. But the glassmakers still live on the island. Not because they must, because they choose to. They know the world has changed, that secrets no longer stay buried, that machines can outpace hands, that tourists forget, that collectors move on. But they continue. They keep the fires lit. And perhaps in the end, that is the most enduring lesson of all. A tradition doesn't need walls to survive. Only people who choose, every day, to keep making beauty even when no one is watching. Story 3. A mile in wooden shoes, the quiet strike of the Dutch canal diggers. You stand ankle-deep in mud, staring across a landscape more water than land. The horizon shimmers with canal mirrors, the sky reflected back in sharp blue slices. You are in the Low Countries, the Dutch Republic, somewhere in the late 17th century. All around, The land is flat, absurdly flat, like the earth forgot to rise here. And it is wet. Relentlessly, stubbornly, soul-soakingly wet. But it is here that a different kind of monument is built, not castles or cathedrals, but canals. Trenches dug not for glory, but for survival. And those who dig them, they do not wear armor, they do not sign their names to history. They wear wooden shoes. A nation below sea level. The Netherlands, as it is now called, sits largely below sea level. A precarious position made possible by centuries of engineering, communal cooperation, and sheer will. Without canals, dikes, sluices, and windmills, this land would return to sea. The Dutch have never taken land for granted. They make it. They reclaim it. Every dry field is a victory over water. Every puddle resisted is political. In the 1600s, this work intensified. The golden age of the Dutch Republic was underway. Trade flourished. Amsterdam rose in grandeur. Ships crisscrossed the globe. But the golden cities required dry land to grow, fresh water to drink, and control over rivers that refused to obey. So they built canals, thousands of them, for transport, irrigation, drainage, and border control. It was a network of lifelines, and someone had to dig them. That someone was usually a canal digger, known locally as a graver. A man with a spade, a barrow, and 2 wooden shoes. Life in the ditch. Imagine the life of a Dutch canal digger in 1678. You are not enslaved, nor are you celebrated. You are somewhere in between, a seasonal laborer, hired by the local water board or a merchant collective. You live in a peat hut, eat rye bread and beer porridge, and work from first light until the horn sounds at dusk. You are paid by the meter, that is, for how much canal you dig. Not by the hour, not by the day. A muddy, wet meter earns a few stuivers, copper coins, barely enough for a meal. The labor is brutal. The land is not dry. Even in high summer, the earth sucks at your boots. The deeper you dig, the wetter it gets. Your wooden shoes keep your feet dry for a few hours. Then they fill with silt. Your legs cramp. Your back aches. The spade is a part of your spine now. No one thanks you. No one remembers you. But without you, the city floods. The unseen power of water boards. The Netherlands developed one of the oldest democratic systems in Europe, not for politics, but for water. Local districts, called waterschappen, elected boards to manage dikes and drainage. These water boards had power, taxing power, enforcement power. In many areas, they wielded more authority than feudal lords. And they were meticulous. Canal plans were drafted with precise measurements, slope angles, and flow calculations. Every ditch had its function. Every sluice gate had its hour. But canal laborers were rarely included in these calculations, at least not as people. They were part of the budget, like rope or nails. In one 1682 report, a supervisor noted, "The work proceeds well. 2 laborers have drowned and 1 has vanished into the peat. A pity, but the South Channel advances steadily." There are no names, only meters. When the meters stopped, it was during the canal expansions near Leiden, a growing textile hub, that the first known silent strike took place. It was not a strike in the modern sense. There were no banners, no chants, no slogans. The diggers didn't walk out. They simply stopped digging. One day they laid down their spades, sat on the canal banks, ate their lunch, waited, stared. The foreman shouted. No one moved. The men were not angry, at least not loudly. They didn't argue. They didn't throw tools. They simply refused to work. Because the earth had changed. The water table had risen after a spring flood. The soil was heavier, wetter, harder to move. But the pay had stayed the same per meter. That meant twice the labor for the same coin. So they stopped. It lasted a day. The water board met that night. The next morning, the pay was increased by a fraction. just enough to coax the diggers back into the mud. But something had shifted. The workers had discovered something powerful, quiet resistance. Not protest, just pause. Sabotage by slowness. Over the next decades, similar pauses appear in the records. Canal work near Utrecht suddenly slows for unexplained reasons. Supervisors complain of sluggish shoveling and laziness. Others call it poor soil morale. There are fines, of course, docked pay, dismissals. But the laborers are easily replaced. Until they are. As more canals are needed, skilled diggers become harder to find. The jobs are dirty, wet, and dangerous. The pay is low, so the diggers begin to wield their scarcity like a shield. They don't shout. They don't organize. They simply dig slower. A wheelbarrow tips over accidentally. A spade breaks. A wooden shoe is lost in the muck, delaying progress by an hour. Supervisors cannot prove sabotage. They call it incompetence. But the diggers know better. They've learned to control time. The wooden shoe legend. You may have heard the old claim that the word sabotage comes from workers throwing their sabots, wooden shoes, into machinery to stop it. This etymology is mostly mythical, but the legend has roots in places like canal ditches. Wooden shoes were a laborer's only protection from wet ground and sharp stones, but they also became a symbol. In one preserved letter from a canal supervisor in 1721, "The men are idle, they sit on their sabots like their thrones. The work lags, we must replace them." The image is comical but pointed. Wooden shoes were how diggers claimed dignity. Sitting on them during pauses was both a gesture and a signal. We are here. We are watching. We are not digging until the terms are fair. No one called it a strike. But the canal didn't grow. And that was enough. How did these laborers, without unions or leaders, manage to change their conditions? Did the wooden shoe truly become a weapon of resistance, or just a symbol misunderstood? And what role did canals, and the men who dug them, play in shaping the Dutch identity of resilience? It is dawn again in the lowlands. Mist rolls over fields like a patient tide, pulled not by the moon, but by the long breath of windmills creaking to life. Below the wooden blades, a thin figure walks along the canal's edge, spade in one hand, sabots tapping on frost-hard earth. A canal digger again. The man bends, scoops, lifts. He is alone but not forgotten. Because by the 18th century, the canal digger, once invisible, has become a symbol. Not one he chose, one he earned. The nation beneath the shovel. The Netherlands, more than most nations, is a constructed idea. Its geography defies nature, and its very survival depends on continued cooperation with and defiance of water. By the 1700s, this identity is fully formed. The Dutch are no longer just traders or map makers. They are engineers of space, planners of possibility. And beneath the great plans, at the bottom of every blueprint, stands the laborer with the shovel. More than architects, more than counselors, more than merchants. It is the graver, the ditch digger, the canal man who lays the lines that hold the nation together. But his name is never recorded. Resistance without words. Unlike weavers, printers, or coopers, canal workers had no formal guilds. Their seasonal, shifting work made them hard to organize. Yet over time, they developed subtle forms of collective memory. In diaries from water supervisors and civic engineers, we find strange patterns. Delays during spring floods, even when the weather clears. Mysterious increases in injury claims during tax hikes. Tool failures coinciding with political unrest. These are not coincidences. These are non-verbal negotiations. The canal workers did not demand change. They simply let the ditch fill back up. And that terrified the councils more than any protest. because a full ditch meant failure not for the digger, but for the state. Canals were not ornaments, they were arteries. If they clogged, the land flooded. If they broke, the crops died. A single withheld day of labor could undo weeks of flow calculations. And the diggers knew it. They didn't chant, they didn't riot. They simply waited. And in doing so, they taught the bureaucrats to listen. The tools of trust. Not all resistance was passive. Some diggers became known for code switching, working efficiently for employers who treated them fairly, and silently delaying those who didn't. Foremen took note. Lists were kept not official but remembered. Give Pieter the North Trench, his men work smooth. Avoid Leendert's crew slow as thawed lard. This invisible labor rating system allowed diggers to shape conditions without needing permission. In rare cases, the men were invited to planning meetings, not to advise but to verify the practical reality of a design. Will this hold? The engineer might ask. Will your men dig this slope? A nod or a frown could alter the blueprint. In one 1759 correspondence between a landowner and a master digger named Tijs van der Meer, we find this curious note. Have Tijs check the dike pitch. If he shakes his head, redo it. We cannot afford another pause like in 56. No union. No charter. Just respect earned with mud and time. Wooden shoes and national myths. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, and the Netherlands evolved into a modern nation-state, something unexpected happened. The canal digger became part of national mythology. Wooden shoes, once the symbol of poor, muddy labor, were now portrayed as charming, humble, Dutch. Illustrations in civic schools showed happy workers in sabots building the fatherland with quiet determination. The truth backaches, wet feet, slow strikes was softened, painted over. In Amsterdam, a statue was proposed in 1822 to honor the workers who drained the sea. It was never built, but in literature and pamphlets, the canal laborer began to appear not as a threat to order, but as a folk hero. One poem, widely circulated among schoolchildren in 1835, praised the man with shovel bent and bowed, whose path the waters dare not crowd. In wooden shoes he shapes the land, and holds the sea back with his hand. The irony, of course, was that many diggers were still alive, still working and still poor. They were mythologized before they were dignified. Mechanization and the last ditch. By the mid-19th century, everything changed. Steam engines arrived. Excavators, pumps, dredgers. Canals could now be dug in months, not years. Whole polders drained in weeks, with machines doing the work of 50 men. The diggers were no longer needed, not in numbers, not in time. And so they disappeared. No fanfare, no ceremony. Just a slow vanishing, like the ditches themselves. Some found work maintaining canals, operating sluices or guiding barges. Others drifted to the cities, working in factories or returning to seasonal farming. A few, too old to adapt, retired in peat huts beside the very trenches they once carved. Their tools were left behind. Spades with worn handles, wheelbarrows with rusted nails, and wooden shoes stacked neatly in corners, soles hollowed by decades of mud. A curious epilogue. Today, tourists buy wooden shoes in airport gift shops, yellow, red, or painted with tulips. They are symbols of whimsy, of windmills, of a cheerful countryside. Few realize that those shoes were once soaked with canal water, filled with peat, and rested each evening beside a bed of straw in a hut that no longer stands. Few remember that a canal was not just a scenic feature, but a contested line between wet and dry, power and silence, labor and control. And fewer still realize that the men who dug these lines, who paused without speaking, who struck with slowness and not slogans, helped shape a nation not through politics, but through presence. quiet, firm, and muddy. But what did these quiet protests teach later labor movements in the Netherlands? How did they shape Dutch attitudes toward cooperation, compromise, and labor law in the centuries to come? The wind moves differently now in the Netherlands. Not over ditches, but down paved roads. Not across peat bogs, but through clean, engineered polders. And where once laborers leaned into spades, now engineers lean into drawings, calculations, logistics, and code. The canal diggers are gone, but their legacy is not. Because the men who once moved water with their hands and wooden shoes didn't just carve trenches, they carved a model for resistance, one that echoed long after their shovels were laid to rest. The labor they left behind. As industrialization swept across Europe in the 19th century, the Netherlands too changed. Factories hummed, steamships arrived, rail lines crisscrossed the once impossible landscape. Yet despite all the new machinery, work remained uneven. Wages fluctuated, hours stretched, conditions worsened, especially in textile mills and peat-cutting industries. Labor unrest stirred across Europe, but the Dutch response was different, slower, quieter, more procedural. Historians now look back and ask, why? Why didn't Dutch labor movements erupt into mass violence, like in France or Germany? Why was negotiation, rather than confrontation, the Dutch method? The answer, in part, lies in the ditch. Because for generations, workers had learned that you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stop digging. Echoes in early unions. By the 1860s, labor groups were forming across the Netherlands. They were modest reading circles, mutual aid funds, informal cooperatives. Many were formed by workers who came from rural traditions, former canal diggers, dike builders, and agricultural laborers. These workers brought with them a worldview shaped not by factories, but by water-board systems where consensus ruled, and where quiet refusal had long been the sharpest tool in the shed. In early union pamphlets, we see this tone clearly. We do not need to break the wheel to steer it. We simply need to pause our turn. And let the trench fill if the wage does not. Even the language is canal-like, fluid, measured, calm. The first National Labor Conference in 1893 included a speech by Bram Stuyven, a mill worker turned organizer. He referenced canal work explicitly. When the land was still wet and the ditches ruled our day, my father taught me to lay down the spade when the water reached my ankles. He said, "The land will wait, but your back will not." That is the wisdom we carry. This ethos of collective patience would shape Dutch labor relations for a century to come. The polder model, a national philosophy. By the mid-20th century, the Netherlands became internationally recognized for its distinctive approach to economic and labor policy, the polder model. Named after the reclaimed tracts of land surrounded by dikes, the polder model emphasized consensus building, negotiation over confrontation, inclusion of employers, employees, and government in tri-party talks, long-term thinking, minimal disruption. It is tempting to think this model sprang from clever bureaucracy or post-war pragmatism. But look closer. It's canal logic. It's ditch politics. It's the rhythm of men who knew that the land was only dry if everyone agreed to keep it so. Water didn't respect hierarchy. It flooded rich and poor alike. So you didn't dig alone. You dug together, or you didn't dig at all. The model of cooperation, of pause instead of protest, was not a modern invention. It was an inheritance from wooden-shoed ancestors who taught the nation how to shape the earth by listening to it. Sabots in the archive. In the 1990s, during the restoration of a former canal manager's office near Utrecht, a pair of wooden shoes was discovered mud-caked, carved roughly, worn smooth on the heel. They were displayed for a time in a local museum. No name, no date. Just a note. Workers' sabots found in former canal basin, estimated late 18th century. Next to them, a quote from a municipal record. The men have not dug today, they wait, the trench stands open. No rebellion, no violence. Just a moment of stillness recorded, remembered. A small act of defiance that moved no earth but shaped history. Today the ditches still drain. Modern Dutch engineers manage water with satellites, digital sensors, and automated locks. Entire neighborhoods sit on former sea beds, held dry by pumps older than the residents. But every canal still traces the ghost of a laborer who once measured the day in spadefuls, who bent at the waist not for glory, but for bread. And occasionally, a maintenance crew finds an old spade blade in the muck, or a brick-lined drain with initials carved in the mortar, or more rarely a scrap of sabot wood, softened by centuries but unmistakably human. The past whispers, not in monuments but in moisture. And if you walk beside a rural canal on a foggy morning, you may still see it. A figure in the distance, bending, lifting, pausing, waiting for the land to decide if it will stay dry today. Story 4. Ledger lives, the forgotten paperwork of the Han Dynasty clerks. You are in a room made of clay and silence. Dust floats in the sunlight filtering through a narrow window. Reed mats soften the stone floor. In the corner, a bamboo brush leans in its pot, the tip soaked in black ink, fresh, sticky, and sharp-smelling. This is not a scholar's study, nor a poet's chamber. It is a records room, deep in the administrative quarter of a provincial town in the Western Han Dynasty, around 140 BCE. You are a clerk, and you are not meant to be remembered. An empire of records. The Han Dynasty, rising after the collapse of the short-lived Qin, is often celebrated for its territorial expansion, Confucian bureaucracy, and cosmopolitan trade. But beneath the bronze and banners, beneath the military victories and philosophical reformation, lay something quieter, something more critical to the dynasty's longevity. Paperwork. Tons of it. Before paper became widespread, records were etched into bamboo slips long, narrow strips tied together with string. Others were written on silk scrolls or carved into wood. Every shipment, every tax paid, every grain delivery, every corvée labor conscription was documented. And the people who did that work, not nobles, not generals. Clerks, low-ranking bureaucrats trained not in combat, but in calligraphy. They built the empire line by line. The clerk's day. Imagine your day. You rise before dawn in shared housing with other junior officials. You boil millet porridge, chew dried jujube fruit, and walk to the archive building carrying your brush kit. Inside, there is no fanfare, only task. You are assigned to review and copy the tax intake of millet for the past 10 days. You retrieve a bundle of bamboo slips from the previous clerk, unroll the twine, and begin reading. The handwriting is rushed, slightly tilted, someone late to dinner perhaps. You frown. The numerals are smudged. You cross-reference them with a delivery receipt, find a mismatch, and make a note for the local magistrate. You do not accuse, you do not speculate. You simply record. Each slip you copy, annotate, or file must be returned with a small wax seal of your name. Any errors reflect on you, not the original writer. If you are found to have falsified or misfiled information, the penalties range from fines to corporal punishment or worse, reassignment to border garrisons. Not death, just oblivion. A life in silence. You do not speak much. Your colleagues are focused, tired. Many have eye strain. Others have shoulder cramps from long hours hunched over scrolls. You are not supposed to have opinions on the data. Only fidelity. The records pass through your hands like river water. Tribute tallies, court edicts, arrest warrants, birth registrations, salt ration logs, silk shipment manifests, messages from the capital. You do not know who writes these things. You only know where they go. To the shelf, to the archive, to the empire's memory. And your own, it fades into the margins. You are not carved in stone. You are written in ink. And ink fades. Names on bamboo. And yet occasionally something slips through. A clerk's name scratched into the back of a ledger. A complaint scribbled in the margins, too much rice, not enough help. A doodle. Yes, even here, a figure drawn with crooked arms balancing a bucket, a donkey beside him. The caption reads, Supervisor Howe after 4 cups of wine. Small rebellions. Tiny signals of life. Because even in the most regulated of spaces, humanity finds its way in. One archaeologist in the 1970s discovered a bamboo slip in Hunan that, instead of listing census data, read, "The sun is too hot today, I sweat. No one comes, still I write." A record certainly, but not one anyone asked for. The clerk's role in power. To the emperor and the court, clerks were invisible but essential. Without their ledgers, the dynasty could not know how many horses were needed in Liang province, how many bushels of millet had spoiled in the floods, how many convicts were relocated to the western frontier, how many widows received mourning cloth this season. Without records, there was no rule. That's why even the most remote counties had clerks. And that's why the central court sent inspectors, known as yushi, to check the quality of administrative logs. One missing slip, one incorrect seal, and an entire district might face investigation. So you, the clerk, take great care. You do not embellish. You do not summarize. You do not assume. You copy exactly what is written. Because you are not here to create history. You are here to document it. Bureaucratic survival. Life as a clerk is precarious. You're paid just enough to live, not enough to rise. Promotion is rare but possible for the precise, the tireless, the unfailingly loyal. Some clerks spend years mastering the proper format of imperial correspondence. A misaligned margin can cause a reprimand. An extra character might delay an entire decision. The form is more important than the content. In Confucian ideology, to serve the state is to serve virtue, and the clerk, though lowly, is a necessary channel of that virtue. But in truth, you serve order. You are not a philosopher, you are not an artist. You are a stabilizer. And when rebellions rise, as they occasionally do, the first thing warlords seek out are the grain stores, the weapons caches, and the ledgers. Because to control the records is to control who owes what, who paid, and who lives where. The pen, in its own way, precedes the sword. But what happened when clerks grew too powerful, when their quiet penmanship became influence? And what did the fall of Western hand mean for those who built the empire's memory? The records continue to pile. Slip by slip, scroll by scroll, the archives swell like rivers after monsoon rain. You, the clerk, are still at your post, still bending over ink and brush, still recording the ceaseless pulse of the Han dynasty, one shipment of millet, one arrest, one tax payment at a time. And now something has shifted. Not the procedure. The power. When clerks became gatekeepers. In the Western Han's later years, particularly under Emperor Wu, R 140-187 BCE, the bureaucracy expands dramatically. More territory means more provinces. More provinces mean more reports. More reports mean more clerks. The central court, bloated with administration, begins to rely increasingly on mid-tier bureaucrats to manage local offices. These clerks, not nobles, not magistrates, but scribes and recorders, become critical bottlenecks in the flow of information. A single report can travel hundreds of miles from the rice paddies of Jiangnan to the court in Chang'an, but it must pass through multiple hands, each one a clerk, each one holding a brush that determines how and when data is seen. And here, amid the careful copying and silent filing, opportunity emerges. The rise of the record keepers. As magistrates rotated every few years, a rule meant to prevent corruption, the clerks stayed in place. They knew the towns, the families, the informal rules, the bribes, the favors. A smart magistrate learned quickly. Ignore the clerk and the office faltered. Some clerks began writing reports that favored those who paid extra. Others delayed paperwork until promised gifts arrived. A few used their record access to manipulate property disputes, redrawing lines subtly, shifting characters just enough to alter ownership. The brush became a blade. Still, not all clerks were corrupt. Many were meticulous, honest, and devastatingly precise. But the very nature of their invisibility gave them power without spotlight. They didn't command armies. They defined reality. If a name was left off a registry, that person ceased to exist for tax, for tribute, for protection. If a fine was recorded when none was paid, a family could lose its fields. In the shadows of emperors and generals, it was the clerks who held the levers of continuity. And they knew it. The politics of paper. During the rebellion of the Seven States in 154 BCE, much was written about noble houses clashing with imperial authority. Less is said about the army of clerks who maintained provincial records during the chaos, ensuring food stores were logged, labor rosters maintained, and legal notices posted. A court historian, Ban Bio, wrote decades later, "The sword may take a city, but the seal preserves it." He was not referring to emperors. He was referring to bureaucrats. One recorded case from the region of Nanyang in 130 BCE involved a group of clerks who, when their magistrate fled during a local uprising, remained behind to maintain the records. They continued writing, sealing, and dispatching reports, knowing no one might read them. Why? Because to stop writing would be to lose the thread of the state. They believed that as long as the records survived, the order could be restored. And when imperial troops eventually returned, they found the archive intact, the ledgers updated, the laws preserved. The clerks were not rewarded, but they were remembered. In the margins of the logs they had written themselves. Dissent in the margins. With great responsibility comes a whisper of rebellion. While few clerks would openly challenge the state, some used their position to push back in the only language they knew, annotation. In court archives recovered from excavated tombs in Hubei province, researchers found bamboo slips bearing faint, unauthorized commentary. On one tax record, amount exceeds previous by 1/5, unclear justification, farmer has only 1 ox. On a conscription list, man listed as able-bodied but limps, was injured hauling salt bricks, confirmed by neighbors. These were not public protests. They were footnotes of dissent. Not meant for anyone, but not entirely hidden either. Some clerks were careful, others grew bold. One slip never sent reads simply, "There is no rice, only orders for rice. The ink will feed no one." It's unsigned. It shouldn't have survived. But it did. A silent protest, left between brushstrokes. Fall of the Western hand, collapse in continuity. By the early 1st century CE, the Western Han dynasty begins to falter. Factions in court, economic strain, natural disasters all accelerate the decline. And yet in provincial offices, the clerks keep writing. They record crop failures, rising food prices, flooded fields, disappearances, rumors. They also record late tax receipts, missing officials, Abandoned villages. In some regions, the records end abruptly, bundles of slips burned, scattered, or left incomplete. In others, they continue for years, even after the local government collapses. Because the clerk stayed, it was perhaps stubbornness, or discipline, or belief, that even if the dynasty falls, the archive must live. It is telling that, when the Xin dynasty briefly replaced the Han under Wang Mang, 923 CE, one of the first acts was to reissue record-keeping protocols. The state may change, but the bureaucracy survives, because somewhere a clerk is still writing, still brushing ink across bamboo, still keeping track, even if no one ever reads it. But what becomes of these records? How do archaeologists today uncover the quiet lives of these invisible scribes? What fragments survived? And what do they say about a class of people who never ruled but who recorded everything? You are no longer in a records room. You are in a laboratory, centuries later, where gloved hands delicately unroll a brittle bundle of bamboo slips. Each strip is the width of 2 fingers, stained by time and soil. The characters inked with a brush 2,000 years ago are still visible. Not elegant, not poetic, but precise. Here in these fragments, the Han dynasty breathes again, not through gold, not through temples, but through lists. The rediscovery of the clerks. In the mid-20th century, Chinese archaeologists began excavating tombs near remote Han-era administrative centers. What they found wasn't treasure in the traditional sense, but it was priceless. Bundles of bamboo and wooden slips, buried deliberately, stored with care. Not imperial decrees, not literature, but bureaucratic records, tax logs, legal decisions, calendars, military rosters, market inventories, supply audits, each tied together with string, sometimes bundled by year, sometimes annotated. They had not been meant for eternity, but they endured. And in doing so, they pulled thousands of unknown clerks from the shadows of history. Julian and the frontier clerks. One of the richest troves of Han documents came from the Julian region, near the edge of the empire's northwestern frontier. There, in desert ruins, archaeologists discovered over 30,000 wooden documents preserved by the dry climate. Many were military and nature guard rotations, supply counts, patrol reports. But some were personal. A log from a supply officer. Rations short again. No salt. Soldiers barter with nomads. Please confirm weight of wheat received, suspect short measure. Another from a clerk stationed at a beacon tower. Winter thick. Ink freezes before brush. Recommend additional rations for scribe and assistant. These were not generals, not court advisors. They were recorders, whose only duty was to capture what was. And yet they left behind something no monument could. Continuity. Even as dynasties fell and borders shifted, the paperwork stayed. It was the foundation the next empire would stand on. Fragments of daily bureaucracy. In Zhangjiashan, a tomb unearthed in the 1980s yielded hundreds of slips, many of which described legal procedures and statutes. There were rules for debt collection, property inheritance, corporal punishment. But among them was a series of slips clearly used by a low-level clerk as a case log. It included the names of disputants, a brief description of the matter, the verdict rendered, a fine if applicable. It wasn't elaborate, but it showed that clerks weren't just passive copyists. They were gatekeepers of law processing, relaying, and sometimes interpreting decisions. On one slip, a clerk notes, dispute over boundary stone, both parties drunk, return for hearing when sober. A note of irritation, a glimpse of personality, a reminder that bureaucracy is never faceless, only under-acknowledged. Why they wrote. For hand clerks, writing was not self-expression, it was function. But sometimes, the function blurred into ritual. One set of slips, found near a rural administrative site in Gansu, records monthly temperature and wind direction, sometimes annotated with odd side comments. Wind from north, cold, rats seen in storehouse. Rain heavy, no deliveries, scribe ill. No one had asked for this. It was not a mandate. But someone kept the data. Why? Because in the mind of a clerk, to record was to control, to bring order to the unpredictable, whether it was rice deliveries or rainfall. Perhaps it was faith. Perhaps habit. Perhaps a quiet act of preservation in a chaotic world. A belief that if the ink survived, so would the meaning. The legacy of invisible hands. Today, historians reconstruct entire regions of Han administration based on these records. We know how many bolts of silk were shipped to border garrisons. We know how long a conscript served before being rotated home. We know the daily rice intake of a provincial jail. All because of clerks who were never named, who never ruled, who rarely traveled beyond their county lines. They are, in a sense, the ghostwriters of civilization. And while emperors were memorialized in stone, it is the bamboo records carried, copied, sealed, and stacked that allow us to see the state they ruled. Not the image they crafted, but the system they relied upon. An ink-stained reflection. So what becomes of those who build the skeletons of empires? What happens to the ones who do not speak loudly, but record the noise? What honor is there in remembering quantities, in counting soldiers, in logging silences? The Han dynasty collapsed, its successors rose and fell, cities burned, walls crumbled, statues shattered. But somewhere in a controlled archive drawer, a bamboo slip rests. It reads, 2 measures of millet received, seal confirmed, recorded by the hand of Zhang, clerk 2nd class. Zhang is gone, but his line survived. Because he wrote it. Because he thought it mattered. Because someone someday might want to know. And now you do. Story 5. Dust, dye, and daily bread. Life inside a medieval dye shop. You can smell it before you see it. Sharp, earthy, faintly bitter. A mixture of fermented roots, crushed insects, stale urine, boiled alum, and damp wool. You are not in a royal court or a painter's studio. You are in a dye shop, in a small medieval European town, around the year 1297. The streets are narrow. The stone buildings lean slightly, as if whispering secrets, and here, tucked between a baker and a cooper, the dyer works. You won't remember his name, but everything you wear depends on him. Color is hierarchy. In the Middle Ages, color was not fashion, it was identity. Blue was trust. Red was power. Green was fertility. Black was law. Purple was reserved for emperors where permitted at all. But these weren't choices made at random. Every hue came with a cost, a meaning, and a regulation. Sumptuary laws, rules about who could wear what were common across Europe. In England, commoners were often banned from wearing scarlet or imported dyes. In Florence, only members of specific guilds could wear silk of particular tones. In Paris, servants were encouraged to wear brown. So when a customer walks into a dye shop, he's not just choosing a color. He's announcing his status. And behind that status is the dyer, his fingers stained, his eyes weary, his nostrils dulled. The shop, a factory without machines. The medieval dye shop is not glamorous. It's functional, damp, and mostly outdoors. Barrels line the yard, each marked for a different dye bath. Madder red from roots. Woad blue from fermented leaves. Weld yellow from flowers. Indigo imported expensive. Kermes crimson from insects. Logwood deep black from overseas. Some are local, Some come via trade through Venice, Marseille, or the Hanseatic ports. The exotic ones cost more than meat. Near the barrels are the fulling stones where fabric is pounded to open its fibers and allow the dye to penetrate. It is labor-intensive, repetitive, and loud. And of course, there is urine collected from public jars at inns and alleyways, then poured into vats. Fermentation releases ammonia, which helps fix the dye to the cloth. The smell is permanent. Dyers live in it. They carry it with them. And when they pass in the street, others step aside not out of disgust, but out of recognition. An apprenticeship in stains. To become a master dyer, you must begin young, often as early as 10 or 12. You sweep the yard, stir the vats, wash the wool, cut the logs. You learn the rhythms of heat and time, how long to boil, when to cool, how much ash to add, when to lift the cloth, and how to tell by eye alone when the color will hold. There are no timers, only experience. And if you get it wrong, the color runs, the fabric models, the client returns angry. And you, the apprentice, scrub the mistake while your master negotiates a refund in tense whispers. Some dyes must be layered. A green cloth is often made by first dyeing in blue, then yellow. Purple requires red over blue, carefully balanced. Black needs a base of tannins, overdyed with iron-rich liquids. Each process takes days, sometimes weeks. Dyeing is not painting. It is alchemy. And sometimes it fails. Guilds and the dyer's boundaries. Most towns with a functioning dye economy have a dyer's guild. It is part labor union, part regulatory body, part insurance collective. The guild tells you what dyes you can use, what prices you may charge, how many apprentices you may take, which water sources are yours, when you may dump waste into the drainage canals. Break these rules, and you risk banishment not just from the guild, but from the entire town economy. In some cities, rivalries flare between dyers and fullers or weavers and bleachers. Each wants to expand their domain. Who gets to wash the fabric first? Who's liable for damage? Who sets the price for noble clients? The guild mediates, and you, the dyer, follow. Because outside the guild, there is nothing. No protection, no access to materials, no right to trade. You are your stains. You are your bucket. You are your guild. Tools of the trade. The dye shop's tools are few but sacred. The stirring stick, a polished oak rod blackened from years of use. The dipping rack, a series of notched beams where wool is suspended in vats. The pH stones, used to test acidity by taste or touch. The dye book, kept by the master with notes, formulas, client requests. This last one is never shared. Each master has their own recipes guarded like family treasure. The amount of alum, the drying times, the order of dye baths, the strange tricks passed down from mother to son, father to niece. If you steal another master's recipe, you don't go to prison. You go to court. The guild court. And if found guilty, you may lose your rights to dye. Forever. Color is currency. And counterfeit is a crime. Dye is diplomacy. It is not uncommon for a wealthy patron, a merchant, a noble, a bishop to arrive with a very specific request. A robe the color of oxblood at dusk. A gown as red as the Pope's slippers. A banner to match the summer wheat. These are not vague wishes. They are tests. The ability to reproduce these tones is a sign of prestige. Failure is humiliation. Success brings more work, better coin, and the subtle respect of one's peers. And if word spreads that your shop can create a shade scene only in Florence, then you may be remembered. Not in chronicles, but in whispers, among dyers, among those who know what it means to pull color from rot, beauty from waste, status from stink. But what did it mean to live with your hands in color, yet outside the privileges that color represented? How did the daily life of a dyer contrast with the symbols they helped create? You've spent the morning boiling madder root. The steam rising from the vat is thick and pink, tinged with the scent of decay and iron. Across the courtyard, strips of damp wool hang from a pole like limp flags after battle. Your hands are red, though you no longer notice. You are a dyer, and though your work clothes the powerful, you are never invited to the feast. Color is for others. It's easy to forget in this age of abundance that in medieval Europe color was rare, expensive, carefully regulated. For the nobility, wearing color was permission, a visible signature of wealth, station, or affiliation. For the church, certain hues held symbolic power. A cardinal's robe wasn't just red, it was scarlet, and that scarlet came from crushed insects shipped over land from the Levant, fermented in wine and alum. That scarlet may have passed through your vat. You may have stirred it, tended the fire beneath it, soaked the cloth. But when the garment is worn in procession, when trumpets sound and incense fills the nave, you are not there. Not watching, not remembered. Only your stain is present, clinging to the hem of another man's robe. It is an intimacy that never becomes familiarity. You give color. You remain gray. The dyer's family. Behind every dye master is a household built around fluid routine. Someone must fetch water, often the apprentice, often multiple times a day. Someone must stir the vats, keeping the temperature just right. Someone must monitor the steeping cloth, watching for uneven tones, pinching the fibers to test absorption. Someone must handle clients' record orders, deliver samples, negotiate payment. In many cases, this is not a staff, it's a family. A wife may measure the alum, a daughter may sort the yarns, a son may haul firewood and listen quietly to the murmured secrets of the dye house. Dyeing in towns both large and small is a domestic craft, but one governed by external regulation. The guild inspects your vats. The city taxes your imported mordants. The church occasionally fines you for discharging waste into holy waters. Yet still you persist. Because though it is humble, dyeing is reliable. People will always want color, and they will always need someone else to suffer to produce it. Stains as status. Your body tells your story before you speak. Your hands are red from madder. Your fingernails are blue-black from indigo. Your apron is a palimpsest of seasons past, yellow splashes from weld, a green streak from last week's failed overdye, the purplish hue from a nobleman's silk trim. You wear your profession on your skin. And people know. Children point, butchers nod, chandlers greet you with mild deference. But when a merchant's wife walks by in a cloak you dyed, she does not look. Because the color is hers now, not yours. Your intimacy with pigment makes you visible and invisible. A walking contradiction. Needed but overlooked. Dye, disease, and risk. The dye house is not a safe place. Fumes from fermentation can burn the eyes. Some substances like orpiment, a bright yellow pigment, contain arsenic. Contact with certain plants causes skin blistering. The mixture of stale urine and wood ash creates ammonia-rich gas, particularly dangerous in enclosed rooms. There are no gloves, no masks, no ventilation. And yet, you're not considered a dangerous worker like a miner or a tanner. You are just dirty. Not tragic. Just unpleasant. Apprentices often suffer respiratory illnesses in their 20s. Masters develop stiff joints and yellow teeth. Few people grow old at the vat. The reward. Consistency. Dye work never booms or busts. Color is always in demand. So you trade health for security. It's not a decision. It's tradition. Clients in class. Your clients arrive in waves. The monk requesting cloth for altar linens. The noble steward demanding a match to a banner from Burgundy. The widow bringing in her son's only tunic, hopping to hide a wine stain with dark dye. The weaver dropping off undyed bolts, grumbling about last week's rates. Each one must be handled differently. Some want conversation, others disdain even a nod. You learn to read them, not their faces, but their cloth. A coarse linen shirt means haggling. A silk scarf means deference. A wool cloak in imperial blue means silence and precision. You are rarely praised. If the color is right, they say nothing. If it's off by even a shade, you'll hear about it for weeks. Or worse, the work is rejected, unpaid. You may then salvage the cloth with an overdye, sell it to a lower client, and pray that no one recognizes the mistake. It's not just cloth, you manage its expectation. Quiet resistance. Some dyers begin to develop habits of resistance. Not protest, not openly, but choices. If a merchant cheats on payment, his cloth is dyed slightly unevenly next time. If a steward is rude, the work is delayed, the dye didn't take, you explain. If a town official inspects your shop unfairly, you quietly share his robe's recipe with another dyer in another town. Your only power is color, and you wield it like a whisper. Women and the vat. Though guilds often limited female involvement, women worked in and around dye shops constantly. In rural areas, entire cottage dye industries were run by widows, spinners, and washerwomen. Their methods were rougher, less regulated, but often more innovative. A woman might know how to tint linen with elderberry juice, or how to make a blue dye hold in cold water using vinegar. These skills were passed mouth to ear, mother to daughter, never written down. In cities, women were banned from joining the dyers' guild in many regions, but not from working in the shadows of the vat. They stirred, they scrubbed, they counted coins, and they too went unremembered. But how did the dyer's world change with the rise of synthetic dyes and industrial machines? What did it mean to see your labor mechanized, your expertise replaced by chemistry? The vat is still. The fire has gone out. You stare at the dark pool, once a world of fumes, pigments, and secrets. Now just a barrel of water, gone cold. The cloth no longer comes. The clients have stopped asking for matches to Florence silks or burgundy purples, because the dyer is no longer needed. Not you, not your vats, not your stains. This is the beginning of the end. The Industrial Revolution has arrived. From fire to factory. The transition was not sudden. It crept in slowly, first as whispers in the marketplace, then as odd deliveries from coastal cities. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, chemistry begins to replace botany in the dye trade. What once took weeks of fermentation and layering can now be done in minutes with coal tar derivatives and metal salts. No longer is madder root used for red. Now it's alizarin, synthesized in German laboratories. Indigo, once grown and fermented painfully over weeks, is replaced with synthetic indigo. Kermes and cochineal, once requiring tens of thousands of insects for a single robe, are cast aside for aniline dyes. These new dyes are brighter, more consistent, cheaper, available in quantities undreamed of. Cloth no longer visits your dye shop. It goes to the mill, to the factory with its steam vats, gas pipes, and chemical tanks, to a place where no one's hands are stained, where no one tests pH with their tongue, where no apprentices learn the smells of the seasons, where color is formula, not craft. Guilds dissolve. The dyer's guild, once your protection, your shield, your community finds itself outpaced. There is no regulation on synthetic dyeing, no monopoly on the waterway, no reverence for slow work. Some guilds try to adapt, sending emissaries to learn the new chemical recipes. Others close entirely. Your shop's charter, once read aloud each year in the town square, is now a curiosity in a lawyer's archive. It's not just your business that disappears. It's your entire identity. A century ago, your family's name meant something in this town. Today, children walk by your shuttered shop and wrinkle their noses, not from the smell but from the confusion. What did they do here? The vat sits like a fossil, a relic from a slower world. Resistance and remnants. Not all dyers vanish overnight. Some adapt. They rent space in new factories. They shift from wool to cotton. They learn to read chemical notations instead of watching the boil. But something is lost. They no longer touch the fabric directly, no longer feel the heat of the vat, no longer know a dye's temperament by scent alone. Instead, they manage machines. They measure, not make. For others, the transition is too much. They return to rural life. They take up weaving. Some move to cities, becoming clerks or laborers. A few remain defiantly old-fashioned, dyeing cloth for small local clients who still value natural methods until even those clients disappear. One master, whose name is long forgotten, wrote in a final ledger entry in 1856, "The vat has cooled, the gild is gone, the color is no longer ours." He died a year later. His shop became a grocer's store. No one kept the recipe books. A rebirth in memory. And yet, centuries later, something curious begins to happen. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, interest in natural dyes resurges. Not for industrial purposes, but for history, for art, for understanding, for reconnection. Scholars and artisans begin recreating medieval dyes, replanting woad in forgotten fields, boiling madder root in iron pots, fermenting indigo in outdoor pits, just as their ancestors did. They don gloves and aprons. They read ancient recipes. They try tentatively to bring back color from nature. And they discover something strange. The colors don't always match. The blue is softer, the red fades faster, the green is elusive. But they are alive. They change in the light, they deepen with time, they smell like the past. And they realize what was lost. Color was never just result. It was process. Color was touch, smell, patience, error, correction. Color was a life lived with the rhythms of boiling and cooling, dipping and drying. And in rediscovering it, they glimpse, if only briefly, the dyer's world. Your world. Reflections in the vat. You, the dyer, once stood ankle-deep in the waste of nobility. You stained your hands for others' pageants. You dyed banners for wars you never fought. You made saints' robes shimmer with insect blood. And you were forgotten. But the cloth lived. And in its threads your work remained. Today the synthetic dye floods the world with color beyond imagining. Neon hues, chemical tones, mass-produced, bright and cheap. But sometimes in a quiet workshop, someone still stirs a vat. Someone still waits for the right shade. Someone still listens to the cloth. Not for money, not for rank, but to remember what it means to make. And so the vat is not empty. Not really. Because it held your labor. And your labor left stains that time could not erase. Story 6. Threads of Silence, How Monastic Libraries Preserved Lost Worlds. The room is colder than expected. The stone walls weep moisture in winter, and in summer they trap the heavy scent of ink, wax, and worn leather. A narrow window admits a single ribbon of light, angled perfectly onto a worn oak table. You are not in a palace, not in a university. You are in a monastery somewhere in Frankish Gaul, perhaps, or a distant hilltop in Ireland. The year is 823. And before you sits a manuscript unfinished, unilluminated, written in a quiet hand by an anonymous monk whose life you will never know. But his words, copied carefully from another forgotten scroll, may one day be the only record of a lost world. Because in the centuries after Rome fell and the great libraries of Alexandria, Pergamum, and Carthage burned, it was the monasteries that remembered. A mission to save memory. After the collapse of centralized Roman authority in the 5th century, Western Europe entered what is often and misleadingly called the Dark Ages. Roads decayed, trade networks shrank, cities emptied, literacy became rare, but not extinct. In isolated religious communities far from urban politics, groups of men and women continued an unlikely task. They copied books, not because they were paid, not because they loved the stories, but because copying was an act of devotion. To preserve scripture, yes, but also to preserve order. God, they believed, was not only in the heavens but in the grammar of Latin, the curve of the letter G, the perfect spacing of a sentence. And so the scriptorium, a room designated for writing, became the sacred ground on which civilization's memory was preserved. What they copied. Scripture was paramount: Psalters, Gospels, the writings of Augustine and Jerome. But those were not the only texts. Many monasteries, especially during the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne, began copying. Roman law codes, Theodosian Code, Justinian's Digest. Works of ancient historians, Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius. Treatises on logic and rhetoric, Cicero, Boethius. Mathematical and astronomical texts, Pliny, Ptolemy. Agricultural manuals, Columella, Palladius. Medical guides, often fragmented and misunderstood. They did not always understand what they were preserving, but they knew the words mattered. And that was enough. In some monasteries, monks copied in silence, using signs to request ink, parchment, or help. In others, they recited aloud while others transcribed, a practice known as dictation copying, useful when few could read, but more could write. The result: books that might otherwise have vanished in war, fire, or decay were passed down, generation by generation, through the tired hands of men who took no credit. Parchment and patience. There is no printing press, no cheap paper, no automated layout. Every book is made by hand. The process is slow. Parchment preparation. Animal skins, sheep, goats, or calves, are soaked in lime, scraped clean, stretched, and dried. Each sheet is then cut and folded into quires. Ruling and layout. Before writing, the scribe uses a stylus to mark lines for text and margins. Uniformity is sacred. Writing. Using a reed pen or quill, the scribe dips into ink made of oak galls, iron salts, and wine or vinegar. The ink is sharp, black, and acidic. It will etch into the parchment slightly, making it durable. Copying. The scribe transcribes from a model exemplar. Mistakes are scraped off with a knife. Each letter must be shaped with care. Illumination. If the book is important, an artist, often a different monk, will add decorative initials, gold leaf, and illustrations. Binding. Finished pages are sewn together, sandwiched between wooden boards and covered in leather. Clasps are added to keep the parchment flat. Each manuscript may take months, even years, to complete. Some scribes die before finishing their books. Others begin their training by copying only the shortest psalms, gradually moving to more complex texts. Mistakes are common, but silence covers all. Margins and secrets. Monastic manuscripts are not always neat. Margins are full of notes, corrections, and sometimes doodles. A monk frustrated with a cold room writes, "It is too dark, I can barely see." Another comments on the parchment quality, "This skin is terrible, may God forgive the tanner." Some scribes draw little fish, birds, or faces. Near the bottom of the page, boredom's quiet protest. In one Irish monastery, a scribe writes, "Finished on this day of snow. The ink froze in the pot, my fingers ache, praise be to Christ." And yet the work continued. Because the manuscript was not for the monk. It was for time, for those not yet born, for the preservation of something greater than comfort. Cataloging the unknown. By the 9th century, some monasteries began to catalog their holdings. These early library lists, or book inventories, help historians today trace what knowledge survived and what was lost. In one Carolingian monastery, over 500 texts were recorded. Among them were treatises by Galen on medicine, the plays of Terence, Roman agricultural texts, Bibles and glosses, a fragment of a lost play by Seneca. Most of these works survived only because of these lists. The originals gone, but the copies painstakingly made in silence remained. Some traveled to Italy, others to Spain. A few were buried in monastic ruins and uncovered only in modern times, sometimes centuries later. A book discovered in Bobbio Abbey, Italy in the 1800s, contained not only Christian writings but a rare copy of Cicero, De Re Publica, otherwise lost. The monk who copied it likely didn't know who Cicero was. But he copied the words anyway, because copying was obedience. And in that obedience, something unplanned happened. The past survived. But how did these libraries grow and maintain their collections through centuries of political upheaval, Viking raids, and shifting theological winds? What was the daily life of a librarian monk, and how did these books endure through the centuries? The library is not a grand cathedral of knowledge. There are no marble columns, no spiral staircases, no hushed crowds, just rows of wooden armaria book cupboards lined with carefully wrapped volumes, their spines sometimes labeled, sometimes not. You are in a monastic library sometime in the 10th century. The scent is of old parchment, beeswax polish, and dust. No more than 3 monks are allowed inside at any given time. It is not a place for browsing. It is a place for preserving, for remembering, for protecting something fragile in a world often too loud for memory. The keeper of the books. Among the many roles in a monastery, abbot, prior, cantor, cellarer, there is one rarely praised but vitally important, the armarius or librarian. The armarius is not a figure of prestige. He does not preach. He does not write sermons. He does not manage estates or negotiate with bishops. He manages books. He tracks which volumes are lent out, usually only to other monks. He maintains inventory. He repairs torn pages, rebinds loosened spines, re-inks faded titles. He chooses which texts are to be copied, next often from a designated reading list provided by the abbot. He organizes the scriptorium's production schedule. And he answers for losses. Books in monasteries are more precious than gold. To lose one is not merely a practical failure, it is a spiritual error. A lapse in vigilance, an abandonment of memory. Storage and strategy. Monasteries, especially as they gained wealth, developed systems to preserve and protect their libraries. Books were stored in armaria, cupboards or cabinets in cloisters or chapter houses. Scriptoria, writing rooms often adjacent to the library, kept warm and lit by narrow windows. Chain libraries. In some cases, books were chained to desks or shelves to prevent theft not from monks, but from visitors or ambitious novices. Shelves were shallow. Books were stored upright or flat depending on size. Covers were heavy, often wood-covered in leather, occasionally reinforced with metal fittings. Larger monasteries might house hundreds of books, a staggering number for the time. Smaller houses might only have 10 or 12. Yet even the smallest library often preserved a unique copy of a now-lost work. It wasn't scale that mattered. It was survival. Reading and lent books. Monks were assigned reading materials as part of their rule. Under St. Benedict's rule, each monk received a book at the beginning of Lent to read over 40 days. At the end, the book was returned and exchanged. These were not private collections. Books were tools of formation. The Lent book ritual involved recording the Lent book in a register, publicly handing over the volume in front of the chapter, an expectation that the monk would read, not just possess it. This system meant books were in constant circulation, which also meant wear and damage were inevitable. Hence the quiet, continuous labor of repair. Threats to memory. Books were always at risk. Fire, monasteries often burned. A single spark in the kitchen or from a candle in the dormitory could destroy centuries of copying in an afternoon. Moisture without proper ventilation, damp could destroy parchment. Fungal growth would warp pages, rot covers. Rodents, mice gnawed on leather bindings. Insects chewed through glue. War and raids, most devastating of all, were human threats. In 845, Viking raiders struck the abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris. Among the treasures looted were not only gold chalices and reliquaries, but books. Some were burned, some taken as fire starters or bedding, some lost forever. In England, during the Danish invasions, countless monastic libraries vanished. But in a few places, monks hid the books, buried them, fled with them, secreted them into caves or under chapel floors. A few were recovered centuries later, molded and stiff, but legible. Proof that even amid chaos, there were those who remembered the value of memory. When words become borders, books in monasteries were not merely for internal use. They also became tools of diplomacy, status, and even protection. A gifted manuscript could forge ties between abbots. A rare volume could be used to impress visiting bishops. A well-organized library could become a mark of legitimacy, evidence that the monastery was part of a wider network of knowledge and sanctity. Even more subtly, books allowed intellectual independence. A monastery with access to texts by Augustine, Isidore of Seville, Bede, or Boethius could train its own scholars, interpret scripture without relying on distant bishops, and maintain a level of autonomy. Books gave monasteries identity, not just liturgical or spiritual, but intellectual and political. And so protecting them became an act of self-preservation. A book was not just parchment. It was continuity. The silent heroes. The average monk in a library will never be named in a chronicle. No miracles will be attributed to him. No hagiographies will record his work. No stained glass will bear his likeness. He simply copied. And when not copying, he shelved. And when not shelving, he checked for worms. This was his life. Decades, maybe, of watching pages accumulate, of watching brothers die, of watching books worn down by reading, but not forgotten. And perhaps, when the time came for his own death, he asked to be buried with a piece of parchment blank, perhaps as a final gesture of dedication. There are gravestones with no names. But in the library ledgers in cramped Latin script, there are initials. Finished by Brother C. Begun under Brother Will. Corrected by Brother Ide. Not much, but something. Enough, maybe, to whisper that they lived. But what happened when the Renaissance arrived, when scholars from Italy and beyond began rediscovering ancient texts in dusty monastic libraries? What became of the monks' quiet hoards when the world suddenly remembered it had a past? The library is no longer silent. You hear the creak of boots foreign hurried, the rustle of parchment disturbed, the scraping of a chair dragged out too quickly. You are no longer in the 10th century. It is the early 15th, and something unexpected is happening. Men young, curious, trained in Latin but not vows are arriving in your cloisters, asking questions no monk has asked in generations. They hold books written in Greek. They speak of Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy. They are not here to pray. They are here to search. Because the outside world has remembered that knowledge was lost, and it is now desperate to find it again. The humanists arrive. With the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe entered a period of intellectual revival. Petrarch in the 14th century had lamented the loss of classical learning. Others followed: Poggio Bracciolini, Niccolò de Niccoli, and Leonardo Bruni. These were the humanists, and they sought not just religious texts, but the full intellectual wealth of antiquity. But where were the books? The answer surprised them: in monasteries, in dusty cupboards under layers of neglect, inside unvisited archives. The texts had been copied, sometimes poorly, sometimes incompletely, but they had been preserved. Because monks had never stopped copying. And now those books were gold. The great manuscript hunts. Poggio Bracciolini, a former papal secretary and one of the most successful book hunters of the Renaissance, traveled through France, Germany, and Switzerland, visiting old monastic libraries in search of ancient Roman works. In 1416, in the library of the Benedictine Abbey of St. Gall, he found a full copy of Quintilian, Institutio Oratoria, long thought lost, forgotten treatises by Cicero, Vitruvius, and others, pieces of Lucretius, De Rerum Natura, an epic poem on atomism and nature. Many of these texts had not been read in over 800 years, but they had survived because someone nameless, faceless had copied them faithfully, even if they did not understand their content. These discoveries sparked a firestorm of scholarship. Books that had languished unread were translated, reprinted, and disseminated with the aid of the newly emerging printing press. In just a few decades, Europe went from a scarcity of learning to a flood, all thanks to centuries of silent labor. From cloister to city, the monastic libraries changed too. Some opened their doors cautiously to scholars. Others sold or gifted texts to universities and patrons. A few even allowed their scribes to work with the printers. In certain abbeys, monks themselves became editors, preparing ancient texts for publication. Yet not all welcomed this shift. Some monks feared that lay scholars would misunderstand or misuse sacred writings. Others worried that worldly books would overshadow scripture. In a few places, disputes arose between abbots and visiting scholars. But in most, a quiet truth held: the books had been preserved for this moment, even if no one had planned for it. The cost of recovery. Not every manuscript was celebrated. To the humanists, the beauty of Latin prose mattered more than obscure theological disputes. Entire shelves of scholastic texts, centuries of commentary, sermons, and local saints' lives were ignored, discarded, or even destroyed. In some cases, ancient parchment manuscripts were scraped clean to be reused. These are known as palimpsests. Ironically, in doing so, Renaissance scholars sometimes erased other ancient texts that had been overwritten during the Middle Ages. The desire to preserve one form of knowledge led to the loss of another. And so, just as monks had once chosen what to copy, the humanists now chose what to save. The library's silence became noise. And not all of it was wise. The printing press and the sunset of the scriptorium. By the late 15th century, Johannes Gutenberg's printing press had changed everything. A book that once took a monk a year to copy could now be produced in days. The scribes, once the backbone of memory, found themselves without work. Scriptoria closed. Apprenticeships ended. The art of copying by hand faded from necessity into curiosity. In some monasteries, monks continued to write for their own edification. A few even copied books as spiritual exercises, not unlike prayer. But the world no longer needed them. The silence once sacred was now obsolete. Yet without that silence, without those centuries of copying, there would be no books to print, no Ciceronian rhetoric, no Ptolemaic astronomy, no Euclidean geometry. Because every printed rediscovery was once a manuscript in a cupboard, a survivor, a relic of dedication, echoes that endure. Today, thousands of monastic manuscripts survive in the archives of Europe. The Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the Vatican Library in Rome, the British Library in London, the Stiftsbibliothek in St. Gallen, the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Each parchment leaf tells two stories: the ancient world that produced the text, the medieval world that preserved it. We often remember the first. We rarely honor the second. But somewhere deep in the binding are the fingerprints of Brother Ulrich, who copied by candlelight, of Brother Edric, who mended a torn folio, of Sister Hroswitha, who catalogued a crate of books during a bitter winter. Not saints, not scholars, just people who believed that memory matters, that words are worth saving, that time should not be trusted to remember on its own. The final line. And so the thread holds. From Roman author, to medieval scribe, to Renaissance printer, to digital archive, each link sustained by choices no one thought heroic. But history does not need heroes. It needs caretakers, people willing to write the same line again and again, people who guard the shelves when no one is looking, people who in silence keep the world alive.